At 26,000 feet, the speed of sound is a traitor. The shells arrive before you ever hear the gun that fired them. On June 26, 1943, 23-year-old Lieutenant Robert Johnson felt his world turn into a blender of glass shards and burning hydraulic fluid. Egon Mayer, a lethal German ace in a Focke-Wulf 190, had dived out of the sun and unleashed a burst that stitched 21 20mm cannon shells through Johnson's cockpit. Trapped behind a jammed canopy with severed rudder cables, Johnson was riding 7 tons of plummeting steel toward the English Channel. The Luftwaffe had shredded the Jug, but they hadn't accounted for the R-2800 Pratt & Whitney engine's refusal to die, or the man waiting in the freezing mud back at the airfield. This was the moment a dying animal earned its legend, and the military's death sentence became a mechanic's masterpiece. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The airfield at Manston was a graveyard for the broken. When Johnson finally skidded his wreck onto the concrete at 170 miles per hour, the engineering officers didn't see a plane. They saw a sieve. The fuselage was riddled with over 200 machine gun holes. The tail was a jagged mess of silver skin and broken ribs. With a flick of a wrist, an officer marked the side with a large white chalk X. In the brutal logic of the 8th Air Force, the aircraft was scrap metal, destined to be melted down into mess kits. But Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski didn't believe in ghosts. While others saw a write-off, Kowalski, a man with grease etched into his fingerprints, saw a challenge that bordered on the supernatural. Standing in the ankle-deep sludge of the boneyard, he proposed a Frankenstein procedure never before attempted in the field, a structural graft. By scavenging the pristine tail of a donor wreck and sewing it onto Johnson's shattered forward fuselage using little more than hand tools and raw American stubbornness, Kowalski wagered his rank on a miracle. This is the chronicle of the Grease Monkey War, where victory wasn't just won in the clouds, but one rivet at a time in the freezing English rain. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 should have been a paperweight. It was missing cylinders, hemorrhaging oil, and coughing black smoke into the freezing slipstream, yet it kept turning the massive 4-bladed propeller as Lieutenant Robert Johnson crossed the English coast. At only 600 feet, he was too low to bail out and too trapped by a jammed canopy to try. Below him, the massive emergency runway at RAF Manston stretched out, a 3,000-yard slab of salvation for the cripples of the 8th Air Force. Johnson had no rudder. The pedals were dead weights in the floorboards. He was steering a 7-ton brick using nothing but engine torque and electric trim tabs. As the concrete rushed up at 170 miles per hour, the P-47 felt less like a fighter and more like a falling safe. There were no flaps to slow the descent, no hydraulic pressure to drop the gear with anything but gravity and a prayer. When the wheels finally slammed onto the strip, the impact sent a jar through Johnson's spine that nearly blacked him out. The Jug didn't bounce. It bit into the runway, screaming down the center line as the pilot stood on the non-existent brakes. He coasted for 2 miles. When the aircraft finally sputtered to a halt in the tall grass at the runway's end, the silence was more deafening than the combat had been. Johnson sat in the cockpit, his hands locked onto the stick, his lungs burning from the acrid stench of cordite and vaporized hydraulic fluid. Outside, the fire trucks and ambulances of the Manston ground crew swarmed the wreck like ants on a carcass. "My God," a medic whispered as he climbed onto the wing. He didn't reach for the canopy handle. There was no handle left. The frame was twisted into a pretzel of alloy. It took 2 men with crowbars and 10 minutes of frantic prying to crack the seal. When they finally dragged Johnson out, his flight suit was soaked in a terrifying mixture of sweat and hydraulic oil. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The ground crew stood in a stunned circle, their eyes tracing the impossible geometry of the damage. The rudder was gone, literally vaporized. The fuselage behind the cockpit was a lace curtain of jagged holes, many large enough to pass a dinner plate through. 21 20mm cannon shells had detonated inside the aircraft's skin, yet the main structural spar held. One of the propeller blades had a clean hole punched through the steel, yet it hadn't shattered. Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski stepped through the crowd, his boots crunching on the spent brass and glass shards littering the grass. He didn't look at the pilot being loaded into the ambulance. He looked at the machine. He ran a grease-stained thumb over a severed control cable that dangled like a dead nerve. To any sane engineer, this was a funeral. The engineering officer was already approaching with a bucket of white paint and a brush, ready to mark the X that would send this fighter to the smelter. But as Kowalski peered into the dark, oil-slicked throat of the engine, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken, something that suggested the half-pint wasn't ready for the boneyard just yet. The morning of June 27, 1943, brought a damp, gray light to RAF Manston that stripped away the adrenaline of the previous night. In the harsh clarity of dawn, Johnson's P-47 looked less like a legendary fighter and more like a discarded tin can. Captain Coleman, the base engineering officer, stepped through the mud, his clipboard held like a shield against the visceral wreckage before him. He was a man of cold mathematics and industrial limits, and the math on this particular Thunderbolt simply didn't add up. He walked the perimeter of the aircraft, his boots squelching in the rain-slicked grass. He didn't see the heroism of the flight. He saw the catastrophic failure of the main fuselage structural bulkheads. The 20mm explosive rounds had peeled the aluminum skin back like an orange, exposing internal ribbing that had been twisted into impossible shapes. The delicate network of the turbosupercharger ducting, the very lungs that allowed the Pratt & Whitney R2800 to breathe at 30,000 feet, was crushed beyond recognition. "It's a sieve, Sergeant," Coleman said, his voice flat and devoid of sentiment. He looked at the tail section, or what was left of it. The vertical stabilizer was a jagged tooth of metal, and the rudder was entirely absent, having been vaporized somewhere over the English Channel. Even if we had a factory jig and a team from Republic Aviation, we couldn't straighten this frame. It's a miracle the tail didn't snap off the moment the wheels touched the tarmac. Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski stood a few paces back, his hands shoved deep into his grease-stained coveralls. He watched as Coleman pulled a thick piece of white chalk from his pocket. It was a small, mundane movement, but it carried the finality of a death sentence. With two swift, violent strokes, Coleman drew a massive X across the silver cowling of the engine. "Strip it," Coleman ordered, turning his back on the wreck. "Salvage the engine if the block isn't cracked. Pull the flight instruments that aren't full of glass shards. The rest of this heap goes to the boneyard. We need the aluminum for mess kits and the hangar space for planes that actually have a chance of flying again." By midday, a flatbed truck arrived to haul the remains away. It wasn't a dignified exit. The aircraft was dragged through the sludge, its belly scraping the earth, until it was dumped in the boneyard, a desolate, waterlogged field behind the hangars where the ghosts of the 56 Fighter Group went to rot. Here, dozens of shattered airframes lay like picked-over skeletons, their wings missing and their cockpits open to the relentless English rain. Kowalski followed the truck, standing at the edge of the muck as the ground crew unhooked the cables and left the P-47 to sink into the silt. The other mechanics saw trash. They saw a logistical write-off. But as the rain washed the soot from the shattered fuselage, Kowalski's eyes drifted 20 yards to the left, where another P-47 lay, a ground loop wreck from the previous week. That plane had a crushed nose and a shattered engine, but its tail section was pristine, glowing like polished silver in the gloom. A dangerous, court-martial-worthy thought began to take root in Kowalski's mind. He looked at the chalked X on Johnson's plane, then back at the donor tail, and reached into his pocket for a roll of measuring string. If he was right, he was about to attempt something that defied every technical manual in the United States Army Air Forces. The mud of Halesworth had a way of swallowing hope, but Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski was a man who lived on a different currency. Standing in the freezing drizzle of late June 1943, he looked at the shattered remains of Half Pint with a clinical, almost predatory intensity. The flatbed truck had dumped the fuselage in the boneyard like a piece of refuse, but Kowalski didn't see scrap. He saw the Pratt & Whitney R2800-21 double-row radial engine, a 2,000 horsepower masterpiece that was still largely intact despite the oil streaks and missing cylinders. He saw the heavy armor plating that had saved Robert Johnson's life, armor that was now scarred but unbowed. "It's dead, Sarge," Corporal Miller muttered, wiping rain from his forehead. He kicked a piece of the shredded tail assembly. "The main longerons are buckled. The hydraulic reservoir is a crushed tin can. You can't weld a ghost back to life." Kowalski didn't answer immediately. He climbed onto the wing, his boots slipping on the oil-slicked aluminum. He peered into the dark, cavernous interior of the fuselage, tracing the lines where the 20mm cannon fire had punched through the radio compartment and severed the main control cables. It was a structural nightmare. A P-47 was built on a series of critical bulkheads. If the alignment was off by even a fraction of an inch, the aircraft would tear itself apart at high speeds. "The Luftwaffe thinks they killed this bird," Kowalski finally said, his voice a low growl. "And the brass thinks she's a pile of mess kits. They're both wrong." He turned to face his small team of mechanics, men who looked like they'd been dragged through a coal mine. I'm not just going to fix it. I'm going to make it better than the day it rolled off the line in Farmingdale. How? Miller asked, incredulous. We don't have the jigs. We don't have the spare fuselage sections. We're in a muddy field in England, not a factory. Kowalski pointed toward the other side of the boneyard, where a P-47 that had ground-looped during a botched takeoff sat with a crushed nose but a pristine tail. We're going to perform a transplant. We cut half pint at station 240, the main structural bulkhead. We do the same to that wreck over there. We slide the good tail onto the good nose, and we sew them together. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a proposition that defied every technical order in the AAF manual. A structural graft of that magnitude, performed in the field without factory alignment tools, was considered suicide. The old man gave us a week to strip the parts before the smelter truck comes back, Miller reminded him. Kowalski checked his watch. Then we have 7 days. In 1 week this plane flies to Berlin. If I'm wrong, I'll take the court-martial. But if I'm right, Johnson gets his wings back, and the Germans get a nightmare they can't kill. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy pneumatic rivet gun. Start the compressors. We're going to need every hacksaw blade on the base. As the first rhythmic thwack 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 of the tools began to echo against the hangar walls, Kowalski didn't realize that his insane promise had already reached the ears of the base commander, and the consequences for failure were about to become much more than just a loss of rank. The rain that swept across the Suffolk countryside on the night of June 28, 1943, was a cold, relentless needles and pins downpour that turned the Halesworth boneyard into a treacherous swamp of oily sludge. Under the flickering glow of a few shielded lanterns, Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski and his team looked like gravediggers. They weren't there to bury the dead, however. They were there to perform a macabre harvest. 20 yards away from the chalk-marked remains of Half Pint sat the donor, a P-47 Thunderbolt that had ground-looped during a heavy-load takeoff, burying its Pratt & Whitney engine in the dirt and snapping the main wing spar. The nose was a ruin of twisted steel, but the tail section remained straight, true, and untainted by German lead. Get the starret blades, Kowalski barked over the rhythmic drumming of rain on hollow aluminum. And watch the teeth. If we bind in the longerons, we'll leave a burr that'll crack under 400 miles per hour of air pressure. The crew didn't use the high-speed pneumatic cutters. The noise would draw the duty officer, and the heat from the friction could warp the tempered 24ST aluminum alloy skin. Instead, they used hand-powered hacksaws, working with a surgical slowness that made their muscles scream in the midnight chill. They targeted Station 240, the critical structural bulkhead where the forward fuselage met the tail assembly. It was the spine of the aircraft, held together by a ring of heavy-duty bolts and thousands of flush-mounted rivets. Kowalski knelt in the ankle-deep muck, his hands numbed by the cold. He guided Miller's saw as it began to bite into the aircraft's skin. The sound was a rhythmic, agonizing screech, metal screaming against metal. As the blade sliced through the duralumin ribs, the bones of the fighter were exposed. They were beautiful even in the dark, a lattice of silver-gray strength designed to withstand 7G maneuvers. To Kowalski it felt like an amputation. They were cutting the life out of one bird to save another, a desperate trade of souls in the middle of a war that demanded everything. By 0300 hours the team was drenched to the bone and shivering, but the separation was nearly complete. They had disconnected the massive turbocharger ducting, the ventral trunking, and carefully labeled every severed electrical lead with masking tape. The most dangerous part was the 4 main longerons, the heavy steel beams that ran the length of the plane. If the tail shifted as they cut the final inch, the weight of the assembly would come crashing down, crushing anyone beneath it or bending the frame beyond any hope of repair. "Steady now," Kowalski whispered, his breath hitching in the cold air. "On my count. 1 more pull." With a final, jagged groan, the metal gave way. The tail section of the donor wreck groaned as it settled into the wooden cradles they had scavenged from the shipping crates. It sat there, a 600-pound severed limb of American industrial might, waiting for its new body. But as Kowalski wiped the muddy slush from the newly exposed bulkhead to check the bolt hole alignment, his heart sank. The ground loop hadn't just wrecked the nose. As the light of his lantern hit the main structural ring, he saw a hairline fracture snaking through the very steel that was supposed to keep Robert Johnson's new tail from snapping off in midair. By the early hours of June 29, 1943, the boneyard at Halesworth had become a theater of industrial desperation. Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski stood before the primary obstacle that separated a madman's dream from a court-martial. Station 240. This wasn't just a point on a blueprint. It was the structural heart of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive vertical bulkhead where the forward cockpit section met the tapering tail. To the uninitiated, the jug looked like a simple metal tube, but Kowalski knew the truth. It was a complex, pressurized organism. "Start on the upper longerons," Kowalski ordered, his voice rasping from the damp air. "If we lose the alignment here, the whole ship will twist like a wet rag the moment Johnson hits 400 miles per hour. The labor was grueling and primitive. Lacking the heavy-duty hydraulic cutters of a Republic aviation factory, the team relied on manual saws and cold chisels. Each man took a turn, the rhythmic shuck-shuck-shuck of steel against aluminum echoing through the dark. Their knuckles were raw, and the freezing rain turned the metal dust into a gray, abrasive paste that ground into their skin. They were cutting through the very spine of the aircraft, 4 massive steel beams called longerons that ran the length of the fuselage to distribute the tremendous torque of the 2,000 horsepower R2800 engine. As the skin finally parted, the team was met with the true nightmare of the P-47's design, the turbo-supercharger ducting. Unlike other fighters, the Thunderbolt's lungs lived in its belly. A massive system of intake and exhaust ducts ran from the nose, all the way under the pilot's seat to the turbine in the rear. These weren't simple pipes. They were large, hollow veins of thin-gauge steel that had to be perfectly airtight to maintain manifold pressure at 30,000 feet. "It's a goddamn maze," Corporal Miller spat, shining his lamp into the dark cavity of the severed fuselage. The explosive shells from Egon Meyer's cannons had turned the internal ducting into a mangled tangle of jagged shards. To perform the transplant, Kowalski's team would have to reach into the narrow, oil-slicked crevices of the fuselage and manually splice these air passages together. One pinhole leak, and the engine would starve for air in the thin atmosphere over Germany, turning Johnson into a slow-moving target for the Luftwaffe. Hour after hour, they fought the metal. They worked in the Station 240 junction like surgeons in a trench, their hands covered in a cocktail of hydraulic fluid, sweat, and rainwater. By dawn, the forward half of Half Pint stood on its jacks, a hollow, yawning shell. Behind it, the pristine tail section from the donor wreck sat on its cradle, waiting for the Union. Kowalski stepped back, his eyes bloodshot as he checked the plumb bobs hanging from the ceiling. The two halves were inches apart, but they might as well have been miles. As he prepared to signal the team to begin the final slide, he heard the distinctive crunch of gravel under tires. A dark olive-drab staff car was rolling slowly toward the boneyard, and the small flags on the fenders told Kowalski his time had just run out before the first rivet could even be set. The morning of June 30, 1943, arrived with a biting wind that whipped through the drafty hangar at Halesworth. Kowalski ignored the olive-drab staff car idling near the entrance. He had no time for reprimands or the nervous stares of the brass. Before him lay nearly 8 tons of American iron, physically separated into 2 jagged halves. The donor tail and the shattered forward fuselage of Robert Johnson's Half Pint were suspended on heavy-duty jacks, separated by a gap of mere inches. In a factory in Farmingdale, this union would be managed by massive steel jigs and laser-precise measurements. In a frontline hangar, Kowalski had to rely on methods that would have been familiar to the builders of the pyramids. "Miller, get the chalk line. And for God's sake, keep your hands steady," Kowalski ordered, his eyes tracking the shadows on the oil-stained concrete. He didn't use a slide rule for the primary alignment. He used string. He stretched lengths of high-tensile twine from the center of the Pratt & Whitney R2800's propeller hub, back through the centerline of the cockpit, and all the way to the tail post. From this primary axis, he hung plumb bobs, simple lead weights on string, that dangled inches above the floor. He used notched wooden blocks and hand crank jacks to micro-adjust the height of each section. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of a fighter, but its flight characteristics were a delicate balance of aerodynamics. If the nose sat 1/10 of a degree higher than the tail, the aircraft would hunt for the horizon like a wounded bird. If the fuselage was coped or twisted by a fraction of an inch, the plane would roll into a fatal, permanent spin the moment it hit combat speeds. "It's not just about the bolts, Miller," Kowalski whispered, kneeling in the dirt to eye the vertical alignment. "It's about the spine. If she feels crooked, she'll fly crooked. And Johnson doesn't have the margin for error." For 6 grueling hours they wrestled with the 8-ton monster. They were surgeons attempting to align a broken back. They used the string lines to check the incidence, the angle at which the wings met the air, and the dihedral tilt. Every time a heavy fuel truck rumbled past the hangar, the vibration threw the plumb bobs into a rhythmic sway, forcing the team to hold their breath and wait for the weights to settle. By noon, the two halves finally looked, to the naked eye, like a single aircraft again. The holes in the four main steel longerons at Station 240 began to align, glowing like tiny silver eyes as they finally met. Kowalski reached for a heavy steel drift pin to lock the sections together, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the point of no return. But as he prepared to drive the pin through the tempered steel of the upper right longeron, a sharp, metallic crack echoed through the hollow fuselage. It wasn't the sound of a tool slipping, it was the unmistakable snap of stressed metal. Kowalski froze, his lantern swinging toward the dark recess of the inner wing root, where a sudden pool of dark amber fluid was beginning to drip rapidly onto the hangar floor. By July 1, 1943, the hangar at Halesworth had become an echo chamber of industrial violence. The silence of the boneyard was long gone, replaced by the relentless, percussive scream of pneumatic rivet guns. Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski hadn't slept in 36 hours, his world reduced to the 4-inch circle of light provided by a wandering inspection lamp. His fingers, numbed by the damp, bone-chilling drafts that felt more like a brutal English winter than midsummer, were stained a permanent metallic gray from the alclad aluminum dust and lubricating oil. The rhythm was hypnotic, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. It was a two-man dance of absolute precision. On the outside of the fuselage, a mechanic pressed the vibrating muzzle of the rivet gun against a flush head fastener. Inside the cramped, dark throat of the tail section, another man, curled into a fetal position among the control cables, held a steel bucking bar against the rivet's shank. If either man slipped by a fraction of a millimeter, the gun would smile the soft aluminum skin, creating a structural weak point that could unzip at 500 miles per hour. They were grafting the donor tail onto the forward fuselage, using thousands of 24ST alloy rivets to bridge the gap at Station 240. To any observer, the aircraft looked like a grotesque hallucination. The front half was the olive-drab soot-stained nose of Johnson's original fighter, while the rear was the gleaming bare-metal silver of the ground-looped donor. It was a Frankenstein fighter, a patchwork monster held together by sweat and the defiant refusal to let the Luftwaffe win. Kowalski ignored the stinging in his eyes as he moved along the seam. They had spent 12 hours frantically patching the leak in the main 270-gallon self-sealing fuel tank, the source of the amber fluid that had nearly halted the project. The 20mm shrapnel had sliced the rubber bladder, and they had been forced to use a field-expedient patch of raw neoprene and adhesive that smelled like a chemical fire. Every hour was a gamble. The engineering officers were due back at dawn with the scrap truck, and the X on the cowling still mocked them through the grime. "Check the tension on the elevators," Kowalski shouted over the din. He watched as Miller adjusted the turnbuckles on the newly run steel control cables. The internal organs of the plane, the turbocharger ducting, the electrical looms, the hydraulic lines, had been spliced and reconnected in a marathon of 20-hour shifts. The team was beyond exhaustion, their movements mechanical, driven only by the rhythmic hammering that seemed to heartbeat through the hangar floor. As the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light over the horizon on July 2nd, the last rivet was driven home. The air compressors hissed into silence, leaving a ringing void in the mechanic's ears. Kowalski wiped a smear of grease across his forehead and stepped back, looking at the two-tone beast. It stood on its own wheels now, looking lethal and wrong all at once. But as he reached for the hand crank to test the main landing gear cycle, he saw a shadow fall across the hangar floor. It wasn't the scrap crew. Standing in the doorway, still wearing his flight suit and looking like a ghost, was Lieutenant Robert Johnson, and he wasn't alone. The morning of July 3, 1943, broke with a chilling clarity that seemed to sharpen the jagged edges of the boneyard's latest inhabitant. Lieutenant Robert Johnson stood on the oil-stained apron of the hangar, his flight jacket zipped tight against the damp English wind. Before him sat a hallucination in aluminum. The forward half of his P-47 Thunderbolt, still wearing the scorched olive-drab paint and soot of its near-death experience, was grafted seamlessly to a tail section of gleaming, unpainted silver. It was a Frankenstein fighter, a two-tone predator that looked like it belonged in a scrap heap rather than the sky. "She's straight, Lieutenant," Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski said, though his bloodshot eyes told a story of desperate doubt. "Measured her with a plumb bob and a prayer. But she hasn't seen a pound of air pressure since we sewed her together." Johnson didn't hesitate. He climbed the black-treaded wing root, his boots crunching on the thousands of fresh 24ST alloy rivets that Kowalski's team had driven through the night. Sliding into the cockpit, the contrast was even more jarring. Behind his head, the pristine silver of the donor tail met the grime of his old office. He reached for the controls. The stick felt tight, too tight. The rudder pedals, once dead weights, now resisted his boots with a mechanical tension that felt alien. He began the pre-flight ritual, his fingers dancing over the familiar toggles of the Pratt & Whitney R2800's throttle and mixture controls. "Clear," Johnson barked. The starter hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the cockpit glass. Then, with a violent, smoky sneeze, the massive 18-cylinder radial engine roared to life. The torque of the four-bladed Hamilton standard propeller immediately tried to twist the aircraft to the left. In a factory-fresh unit, the airframe would absorb this force with ease. In a patchwork monster, every rivet at Station 240 was suddenly screaming under the load. Kowalski watched from the ground, his heart hammering in sync with the engine's percussion. As Johnson taxied toward the main strip at Halesworth, the aircraft wobbled. The mismatched halves seemed to be fighting for dominance. Johnson lined up on the runway, pushed the manifold pressure to 52 inches and released the brakes. The acceleration was a physical blow. The P-47 lunged forward, the silver tail lifting into the slipstream. At 110 miles per hour, the Frankenstein took flight. But as the landing gear retracted with a heavy thunk, the aircraft suddenly lurched. A high-pitched metallic whistle began to fill the cockpit, the sound of air screaming through a structural gap that shouldn't exist. As Johnson leveled off at 5,000 feet and began to bank, the control stick didn't just vibrate. It began to kick back against his hand like a living thing, and the oil pressure gauge on the dash started a slow, rhythmic dance toward the red line. By mid-July 1943, the Frankenstein P-47 had become the most scrutinized aircraft in the 8th Air Force. It sat on the tarmac at Halesworth like a scar across the unit's pride, its forward half a battle-worn olive drab and its tail a glaring, unpainted silver. To the pilots of the 56 Fighter Group, it was a freak of nature. To Technical Sergeant Martin Kowalski, it was a thesis in American iron. Robert Johnson climbed into the cockpit for its first true combat sortie since the resurrection, feeling the weight of two planes fused into one. He wasn't just flying a machine. He was flying the collective defiance of every grease monkey who had ever turned a wrench in the freezing mud. The test came at 28,000 feet over occupied France. The sky was a treacherous patchwork of flak and German steel. When a lone Messerschmitt Bf 109G dived out of a cloud bank to intercept the formation, Johnson didn't hesitate. He kicked the rudder and slammed the throttle forward, engaging the water injection system of the Pratt & Whitney R2800. The Frankenstein responded with a violence that surpassed its factory-fresh days. Kowalski's plumbob alignment had been so precise that the aircraft didn't just fly. It carved through the thin air with a surgical stability. As the Messerschmitt pulled into a steep climb to escape, Johnson rolled the heavy Thunderbolt onto its back and plummeted. At 450 miles per hour, the air pressure against the tail assembly was immense. Thousands of pounds of force trying to rip the donor graft away at Station 240. Any error in the welding or the thousands of rivets driven in the dark would have seen the tail shear off, sending Johnson into a terminal spin. Instead, the plane held. It was stiffer, faster, and more responsive than any P-47 he had ever flown. Johnson leveled his sights and squeezed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns unleashed a wall of lead, nearly 100 rounds per second. The Messerschmitt didn't just catch fire, it disintegrated. The high explosive and incendiary rounds tore through the German fighter's thin skin, detonating the fuel tank and shearing the wings from the fuselage in a spectacular cloud of debris. Johnson pulled back on the stick, executing a 7G pullout that groaned through the airframe, but the patchwork monster didn't flinch. When he taxied back to the hangar at Halesworth, Kowalski was waiting. The pilot climbed down the wing and stood before the two-tone fuselage. He didn't look at the kills marked on the nose. He looked at the seam where the silver met the green. Johnson reached out and patted the cold aluminum. "She's better than new, Sarge," Johnson said, his voice thick with adrenaline. "I think those factory boys in New York could learn a thing or two from a man with a hacksaw." Kowalski just nodded, his grease-stained fingers tracing the line of rivets that had held together under the weight of a war. He had proven that while the Luftwaffe could riddle a plane with holes, they could never break the spirit of the men who kept them in the air. The Frankenstein had officially become a legend of the 56th Wolfpack, a symbol of mechanical intuition over industrial logic. But as the crew began to paint the victory markings on the silver tail, a frantic courier arrived from headquarters with an order that would change the fate of the Half-Pint and its crew forever. Kowalski and his team worked 20-hour shifts in the freezing English mud, risking court-martial just to give a pilot a fighting chance. They didn't ask for a medal and they didn't get a parade. "All I'm asking for is 3 seconds of your time." If you have any respect for the hands that built the machines that won the war, show it. Subscribe, hit that like button, and comment with Frankenstein below. If you can't spare 3 seconds for their story, then the Luftwaffe actually won this round.